Hello, welcome. My name is Susan Hayasa. I'd like to welcome you to our panel today. Before we get started, I'd like to show you something. We're very proud to be able to show you a short video made for San Jose Nikkei resistors by Franco Imperial of San Jose Taiko, featuring some quotes by Reverend Jethro Moore of the Silicon Valley San Jose NAACP, and the voices of many Taiko players around the country. So if you could please play our short video.
A child is not embraced by the village. They burn it down until it fills the water. Because I'm not going to be stimulated until the machine. I want to be outside banging on the machine.
Thank you so much. My name is Susan Hayase. I'm a Sansei. I'm a third-generation Japanese American, and I'm a co-founder of the San Jose Nikkei resistors, which planned this panel discussion. I'm a longtime activist in the San Jose Japanese American community, and I worked with the National Coalition for Redress and Reparations during the 80s and early 90s to fight for redress for former World War II incarcerees. I was honored to have been appointed to the Civil Liberties Public Education Fund by President Clinton, and I served as the vice chair from 1995 to the bill's sunset in 1998. So we're going to have some Q&A at the end. So if you have any questions, please type them into the comments and we'll be able to see those when it's time to address them. So our panel is here to discuss HR40, the Commission to Study and Develop Reparations Proposals for African Americans Act. This is a bill in Congress similar to the bill that created the Commission on Wartime Relocation and Internment of Civilians that studied the World War II U.S. concentration camps. It was introduced in 1989 by the late Representative John Conyers, and it's been reintroduced every year since then. So many of us have been doing public education work about the World War II forced removal and incarceration of Japanese Americans because it's important to us and because former incarcerees told us never again. But sometimes we forget or don't emphasize strongly enough that our Japanese American story is a part of a larger struggle for equality and against oppression that started before the first immigrants touched down on U.S. shores. Reparations for slavery is a current issue for several reasons. One is in 2019, Democratic Party presidential candidates started endorsing HR40. And because today we're at an historic moment when a majority of Americans say that they're agreeing that Black Lives Matter, this means that there's a chance that Americans for the first time could seriously consider this issue. So this is a huge discussion that spans hundreds of years of history and politics. And today our panel discussion is going to give just an introduction to the topic of reparations for slavery in HR40. So I'm going to introduce our other two panelists, Richard Konda and Steve Phillips. Then Richard and I will make some brief remarks. Then Steve will speak at greater length, giving us historical context for HR40. Then we'll have some discussion and Q&A. So Richard Konda is a graduate of the University of California at Berkeley. He attended law school at Santa Clara University, graduating in 1978, and has worked at the Asian Law Alliance since graduating from law school. He was one of the founding members of ALA. Richard Konda was an active participant in the movement to obtain redress and reparations for Japanese Americans. He has received numerous awards and commendations, including recognition by the Santa Clara County Human Relations Commission with the Jim McEntee Lifetime Achievement Award. After the tragic police shooting of Bic Khao Thi Tran on July 13, 2003, Richard was active in advocating for justice for the Tran family. He facilitated the formation of the Coalition for Justice and Accountability that continues to advocate for humane police practices. Currently, Richard serves as the executive director of ALA. Our next panelist is Steve Phillips. He is a national political leader, civil rights lawyer, and senior fellow at the Center for American Progress, and currently hosts the podcast Democracy in Color with Steve Phillips, and is a senior fellow at the Center for American Progress. In 1992, he became the youngest person ever elected to public office in San Francisco and went on to serve as president of the Board of Education. He is a co-founder of Power Pack Plus, a social justice organization dedicated to building a multiracial political coalition. And in 2014, Phillips co-authored the first ever audit of Democratic Party spending and was named one of America's top 50 influencers by Campaigns and Elections magazine. Steve is the author of New York Times bestseller, Brown is the New White, How the Demographic Revolution Has Created a New American Majority. And he has appeared on multiple national radio and television networks, including NBC, CNN, MSNBC, Fox News, and TV One. He's a columnist for The Nation and a regular opinion contributor to the New York Times. He's a graduate of Stanford University and Hastings College of the Law. So, Richard has been a leader in so many struggles for equality and justice in Santa Clara County, and we're very grateful for his thoughts. Richard?
Thank you so much, Susan. I'm so glad to be on this panel with you and with Steve. And the first part of our panel is titled A Right to Petition for Redress of Grievances. Many years ago, I was an undergraduate student at UC Berkeley. The photo exhibit EO966 was touring the US. I went with my family to see that exhibit on a Saturday and was told by my aunt that she was in one of those photos. It's a photo of my grandfather and aunt sitting in a horse stall at the Tanforan racetrack. The Tanforan racetrack was converted into assembly center for Japanese Americans who lived in the Bay Area. My aunt said to me, quote, "Ricky, that is me with Grampy," unquote. I stood looking at the photo for a while. A few days later, on my way to class, I stopped by the exhibit to look at the photos again and looked at my grandfather sitting in a horse stall. My grandfather had died when I was a young child, and my memories of him have faded over the years. But if I want to see him as he looked in 1942, that photo helps me remember him. It helps me to remember that he, my aunt, parents, uncles, aunts, cousins were all incarcerated by the US government during World War II in places like the Tanforan racetrack, the Fresno County Fairgrounds, Topaz, Utah, Aurora, Arkansas, Heart Mountain, Wyoming. The mass incarceration and exclusion of our community has its origins in the long history of anti-Asian sentiment that dates back to the 1800s. The California Supreme Court decided the case of People versus Hall in 1854. George Hall had murdered Ling Sing, a Chinese miner. The only witnesses to the murder of Ling Sing were Chinese. The two white justices of the California Supreme Court interpreted a California law that barred the use of testimony by Blacks and Indians against whites. While Chinese were not specifically mentioned in the California law, the court held that Chinese were not white and should therefore not be included in groups that could testify against whites. The court further stated that Chinese were, quote, "a race of people whom nature has marked as inferior and who are incapable of progress or intellectual development beyond a certain point, as their history has shown," unquote. Since the testimony of the Chinese witnesses was not allowed, George Hall was set free. Following the People versus Hall decision, lynchings and violence targeting at the same time that Blacks were being lynched throughout the US by white supremacists. White nativists in San Francisco were strong supporters of the Chinese Exclusion Act of 1882, the first law in the US that barred immigration solely on race. In 1982, 100 years later, Vincent Chin was murdered by two white men because they thought he was Japanese and blamed him for the success of Japan's auto industry. His murderers received a sentence from a white judge of only 3 years probation and no jail time. If Vincent had been white and the defendants in the case black, they would still be in jail today, 38 years later. In the early stages of the campaign for redress and reparations, we encountered opposition from certain segments of the Japanese American community who told us that time was not right for redress, that we should not rock the boat, then we should just give up. But we continued with house meetings, community programs, the Day of Remembrance programs, pilgrimages to the Tule Lake concentration camp site. Through this process, we started to see a change in the community. More people, including those who had early opposed or were uncertain about redress, began to talk about redress reparations as a real possibility. That is why we need to talk about HR40 as a realistic and attainable goal. Through conversations and dialogue, like the one we're having today, HR40 and the movement for reparations for slavery can be won. The Japanese American Redress Campaign and the movement for HR40 is rooted in the US Constitution, in the Bill of Rights, the right to petition the government. It is a fundamental right. It's right there in the First Amendment, quote, to petition the government for a redress of grievances, unquote. These rights outlined in the Constitution are not earned, but are guaranteed. In fact, redress was won because of the work of regular folks at the grassroots level who were committed to right the wrong of the incarceration of our community. Redress was won because of the strong civil rights coalitions that joined Japanese Americans in the call for redress. These coalitions included strong and powerful voices from the Black community, like African American Congressman Ron Dellums. He made a powerful and impassioned speech on the floor of Congress. Japanese Americans must stand up and stand up strong with our Black brothers and sisters in their just and righteous quest for reparations from the US government. This must be our legacy. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Richard. I was going to just make a couple comments about why San Jose Nikkei resistors want to support HR40. But I think I'll really truncate my remarks so that we can get to Steve quicker. But I just think that it's really important for us to notice that the struggle of African Americans for equality since the beginning of this nation has been one of the greatest inspirations for everyone and many peoples in this country, and that Black people have fought without giving up to make the Constitution and the Bill of Rights actually mean something, even if the system of white supremacy left them out. And so I think that that's something that has been a theme for many of us in the NCRR. We felt that our fight for redress was one for equality and against exclusion. And not all Japanese American organizations felt this way, but it was very important to us to support the efforts of others, such as Native Americans, Native Hawaiians, Black people, Chicanos, and others struggling for reparations and justice. So that's the context for starting to look at HR40. And we're so grateful to Steve for joining us today to talk to us about some of the historical context. He's given some very illuminating podcasts, one called Reparations 101. And we're hoping that he can give us the history and the politics of that led us to the point that we're at now. So thank you, Steve.
Great. Yeah, well, thanks for having me, and thanks for putting this program on. And it is a little bit of a full circle for me in that, I came of age in politics and activism in the 80s, and worked in the Rainbow Coalition, the Jesse Jackson campaigns, and worked with a lot of activists from the Asian American community in general and from the Japanese American community in particular. And so that was one of I have a lot of friends and colleagues who were involved in redress and reparations back in the around the internment back in the 80s. And so it's interesting for me to be back in this point, and I really have this historical connection. And I think I really appreciate the level of the interconnectedness and the awareness of the interconnectedness. And that's something we tried to do in the context of the rainbow, the whole Vincent Chin situation. Jesse Jackson ran. He was the only candidate to actually go meet with Vincent Chin's, parents and family and try to lift that issue up. So the interconnectedness of the struggles. And then it's fascinating, this moment we're in now, because like I feel, I've at a point in time, I'd be like, I can't really imagine how the country could have allowed people to be rounded up and put in camps. But now I don't have any problem imagining that at all in terms of the past 4 years we've had in this country. And so this interconnectedness is, deep, and I really appreciate the attempt and the effort to the platform to talk about what we're trying to do now with HR40, because I do think it's part of a continuum of justice for all different communities. So let me try to test my technological abilities and see if I can share these. Oh, it's not going to let me. Oh, somebody's doing it for me. Yeah, great. Oh, this is great. So thank you. We were making a big push at Democracy in Color around the HR40 campaign this July in particular, June and July. And it came up more in the context of really last year. I mean, frankly, a lot of it got started with Stead Herndon, who's a young African-American reporter at the New York Times. Not young, I mean 26 years old young. And then he just started, he said he's going to ask the different candidates what they thought about reparations. And so at the stature of the New York Times, he was asking them. And then people were like, yeah, I support reparations. So you got a lot of people on board in a way that was unusual in the context of that presidential race. But let me just give a little bit of background in terms of, because I think people may all be aware, but I think maybe it might be helpful in terms of some of how we've tried to frame it up. So we could go to the next slide. So to just in terms of some resources that we can provide for people to make the argument to other people, because not everybody is as aware of what the challenges are. So this is the piece I wrote in The Nation, tried to make the argument and to have some of the historical parts. So that was July 8th, 2020. So we went through that. And then if we go to the next slide. And so we did a whole podcast episode on Reparations 101 in early July. And so let me share the story we told to try to illustrate, and that was very much dating myself in terms of the we used the framework of the TV show The Beverly Hillbillies, and it talks about, it opens up with the story of a man named Jed. And so it's this guy, low-income white guy, walking with his gun, shoots at a animal, misses, and strikes oil. And then that's what leads them to become wealthy. They move to Beverly Hills. Beverly Hills, and lots of jokes ensue. A late '60s show. So the story we told was a reimagining of the Beverly Hillbillies, and we were saying, reimagine, same premise. He shoots his gun, strikes oil, but it's not his land that he strikes oil on. And so but he sees the oil, knows how valuable it is, goes and gets his friends and family, because the land is occupied by Native people. And he brings his friends, kills the Native people who are on that land, and takes control of their house and of all of that land. Then to discover how hard it is to actually pump oil out of the ground, and that's a very labor-intensive job, and they don't want to work that hard. So then he rounds up his friends and family again, and then they go to the neighboring town where there's a family, and let's call them the Blacks, and then they raid that family's house, kidnap the family, take them over to their house where the oil land is, and at gunpoint force them to do the work to extract the value and extract that oil, which then makes them wealthy, and then they create these companies based upon all of that wealth. And then it gets passed down to the children, and they've got all this wealth. And then eventually one day, one of the children of the Black family goes and says, well, can we get some help? Because we've been stuck on this land and haven't been able to get any wealth of our own. And then they say, well, that all that happened a long time ago. We don't owe you anything. And so that was the reimagining that we tried to tell. And I think we're trying to illustrate this point because people draw this connection point. They try to cut off, well, slavery is a long time ago. Lots of bad things have happened in history. So therefore, what are you complaining about? And so the point we were trying to make is there's a contemporary manifestation of this legacy of slavery and of this legacy of discrimination, which has not abated. We had a brief attempt for 10 years during Reconstruction to actually have public policy to redress the legacy of slavery. And then that was abandoned, attacked, Hayes-Tilden Compromise in 1876, I believe it was. And then you have 100 more years of segregation and sharecropping and discrimination and exclusion. The Voting Rights Act, the the GI Bill were consciously exclusionary of African Americans. The whole New Deal excluded domestic workers and farm workers, African Americans and Latinos. You had legalized racial discrimination in housing. Redlining was, there are documents that talk about taking into account the racial composition of a neighborhood in terms of whether to decide, these are government documents, to make a loan in terms of whether or not it's a good loan. So the government sanctioned the exclusion of African Americans from getting property, which became a wealth builder. And I talk about this in my book, that I compare my grandparents' house and the house I grew up in the greater Cleveland area. My grandparents lived in the city of Cleveland, and their house was like $35,000 of worth. And it's only appreciated like $4,000 since like the 70s. Whereas I grew up in the suburbs, and our house basically tripled in value from whatever is, this is Ohio, numbers. And so it's not anything like the Bay Area, but still at the time it was consequential from like, $70,000 to $200,000 in value. And that was enough for my mother to take out a loan against the house, to then be able to pay for me to go to private school, to be able to get an education, a high quality education, get into Stanford, come out to California, etc. But all of that was almost blocked by the people who owned that house, who would not sell it to my parents because they were Black back in 1964. And we had to get a white lawyer, Byron Krantz, to go buy the house, then deed it over to our parents, my parents, so we would have the house that created the wealth that then enabled the family generation to move up. But absent that, we would not have been able to move. So this whole middle class in this country was created through conscious exclusion of African Americans. And you tie that all, and that goes all, and what I didn't even realize I was writing my book, we all look at Brown versus Board of Education and how that was ended segregation in this, legalized segregation in this country. And I didn't even realize it only ended legalized segregation in education. It was perfectly legal in this country to segregate and to discriminate by race in hiring, in employment, in corporate sector, in private sector, in promotions. It was perfectly legal all the way up till 1964, and the passage of the 1964 Civil Rights Act. So you have a legacy in this country that does, and then more recently, this right was all been kind of captured and wrapped together by the New York Times with this phenomenal, really by Nicole Hannah-Jones, who forced the New York Times to do it. To their credit, they were acknowledged it. And so they were able to actually, this whole 1619 project, forcing and trying to use the statute of the New York Times to redefine the beginning of American history, not as 1776, but as 1619, when Africans were first brought to this country to work the land, to generate the wealth, which then has created the current country that we have. So point of all that being that we have a profound racial wealth gap in this country. African Americans have about $11,000 in net worth. Average white family is about $150,000 in net worth. And that is tied to this connection. That's where we try to do that reimagining of Beverly Hillbillies, is that the wealth was created by African slaves. African Americans were continued to be excluded. The white middle class was consciously created by this country. The whole GI Bill basically gave billions of dollars to white people and their families, coming back to almost a quarter of the whole population in terms of when you incorporate the families of who had some connection to World War II and coming back and having, that's the expansion of the suburbs. So all of that are the underpinnings of why we have the racial inequality that we have, and the racial and economic inequality that we have today. Racial wealth gap, and all that flows from that up to and including, somebody had said in the wake of the protests of the death of George Floyd, that the role of the police in this country is to police the border between white America and Black America. And so what happened with George Floyd's murder, and then with the subsequent protest across the country, is that basically a dam was broken, and people saw what Black folks have been experiencing forever, but people didn't really believe that things were that bad. But there was no justification, no explanation other than outright racism for what happened there. And you had this kind of unparalleled period of or moment, and it was unparalleled, certainly in 50 years since the John Lewis and Bloody Sunday, Selma Montgomery March led to the Voting Rights Act in '65. The country looking at and grappling with and taking seriously the oppression of African Americans and systemic anti-Black racism in a way that you never experienced, certainly in my adult lifetime. I mean, it was like it was dissonant, disorienting to see all these mainstream entities expressing their solidarity with Black Lives Matter and their commitment to Black people. And I was like, really? Well, you've had decades to be for this, right? So that, I think, was a lot of so that brings us to the moment, and this is what really pushed us to be able to move this piece forward, is that there was both a reckoning and then a reassessment and really a profound openness. I think literally the top 4 or 5 best-selling books in the country were all about racial justice, right? Ibram X. Kendi's book, How to Be an Anti-Racist, White Fragility. These were the people were trying to really, I think from a good-hearted place, try to figure out and understand better racism in America. So all of that created the conditions to be able to try to move HR40 in a more fundamental and immediate phase. And so that's where we leap back in, tried to push it. And so we'd been told that that if they had 150 co-sponsors, that the congressional leadership would bring it to a vote on the House floor. And big part of the reason they haven't, because they're afraid of the politics of it. We still don't have a social justice politics. We have primarily a politics that's based on fear of alienating white swing voters. I have a chapter in my book I call The Tyranny of the White Swing Voter. So, but what's been promising about this moment, which I think still remains promising, although not quite as promising as it was back in June, in terms of the conditions, is that there's much more awareness and openness and willingness to look at these issues. So if we can go to the next slide. So what we did was we did a poll looking at where people were at and what the level of support was for a commission that would study the legacy of slavery and including possible reparations. And so the support that ultimately was 50% of all, so to go back, it was like 30% support just 1 year ago for there to be such a commission across the board of all voters. And then that's jumped 20% to 50% in the space of 1 year. So that's a significant piece. More to the point, by getting this bill out of the House, is that 86% of the Democrats support creating this type of a commission. And so for a House that's dominated and controlled by Democrats, to have that level of support really leaves very, very little excuse. And then these are some of the other findings that we had in the poll, right? That the sense that Congress is doing too little around racial inequality, that the belief that racial ethnic discrimination is a problem. I mean, one of the big, I think Ibram X. Kendi says this, one of the big problems in this country is denial. And that's partly what unleashed the protest after George Floyd's murder, was that video. And that there was no way you could rationalize that. And so the denial came crashing down, and people then had to confront who they are, who we are, and that's what really set much of that activity into motion. So that poll, we introduced that, we gave that to different people, circulated that in Congress, and tried to push that forward to try to give people backbone and cover that we should actually be able to move this forward. So if we go to the next slide, and so what we've been pushing is really this campaign to try to get more, there are 238, I believe, 230 plus Democrats in Congress. Thus far, we have 143 co-sponsors for HR40. So on the one hand, that's, close to 100 too few, but look through the, lens of history. In 2014, there are only 2 co-sponsors. You had John Lewis, the late John Lewis, and Barbara Lee from Bay Area. So 143 is a whole lot more than 2. And so we're very close to the 150 that they've said they need to move this forward, but we're still not quite there. And so for all the rhetoric that there was in June around the solidarity of Black lives, everybody is not on board with the campaign, is not on board. They're not putting their names where their mouth is. And so we're trying to push people in that regard. And then particularly we're trying to challenge the white Democrat. If you go to the next slide, please. That I do get some of the difficulty, some of the, Black and members of color who are in largely white districts. It's a little more fraught for them to be saying, oh yeah, it should be reparations for Black people. There's a lot of, the assumptions and subjectivity. That's a little more challenging politically to move that forward. But there's very little excuse for these white Democrats. And so we decided to target them. So 73 white Democrats who've not yet signed on as co-sponsors. And so we're calling it the White List. And we launched the White List campaign a week ago, that we were tweeting it out and pushing it out on social media and encouraging people to, and we have on our website this list at Democracy in Color of all the members of Congress, who's sponsored, who's not, and we have the White List on there as well, that really challenging them to step forward and put their names where their mouth is around saying that they support dealing with systemic anti-Black racism. And so that's a big part of what the challenge, what the current campaign is. And we still think this is an opportunity in terms of pushing this forward, shining a light on it, ratcheting up the pressure on these members to do the right thing and to get them over their timidity. It's fine to, make nice sounds when people are marching in the streets, but are you really going to do something significant? And then just to that point around the point of the commission, I think that it been raised a little bit before. At a certain level, it does look at the South African example, right? That South Africa created a Truth and Reconciliation Commission as this major national body to lead the country in a process while looking at what actually happened in its history and coming to terms with that in order to move forward, right? So Brian Stevenson, the lawyer out of Alabama, Equal Justice Initiative, he talks about how in any relationship, when somebody has been wronged, in order to move forward, you have to acknowledge the wrong and then come to terms with it. But there is very little willingness to acknowledge and come to terms with that, let alone study what actually happened and then figure out proposals and solutions and recommendations to actually rectify and remedy the profound inequality which continues to plague the country. And so that's what the point of a commission is. It gives the official imprimatur of the government, highest level of the government, to create this entity to be able to then look at, study is the first part, lead the country through an education process that studies the legacy and the persistent contemporary manifestations of the legacy of slavery, and then to explore a range of recommendations, and that reparations should be on that list. So, and then it depends how one define. You can even get the question of how do you actually define reparations, right? So I'm actually not wed to, probably may not even be a proponent. I haven't fully decided. But just per se cutting. I'm not opposed to people cutting a check, but we need to look at the manifestations of the current inequality, and would it make more sense to have like a Black focused Marshall Plan that really goes at inequality and really, actually, who was saying, oh, Angela Blackwell at Policy Link. So she was raising this idea. He ran it in the New York Times, and an op-ed that they did saying banks should forgive the mortgages of African Americans. And I thought that was a very fascinating type of an approach. Or maybe you could have the government cover, the forgiveness of those loans. And then you get the wealth creation that homeownership provides within this country. So those types of solutions, I think, should all be in the mix. But we need a context to analyze them, discuss them, and then make policy recommendations. And we need a process to move the country through this process of education and understanding, and then hopefully greater support for the public policy solutions. And so that's the basis around really trying to have the commission. And so that is kind of what we had done with the whitelist piece. And so a big part of what we are calling for is to continue to push these congressional members to sign on to the as co-sponsors, particularly the white ones, but anyone who's on the list who people have relationship with. That's one of the main ways we think that could be beneficial to be able to move this forward. And then I think I'm not going to do that last slide. So that's kind of where we're at this point. And that's, I think, what we wanted to share. I still think that, this moment is a little bit different than the moment was when in June, when there was all of this attention and effort around trying to actually deal with systemic racism, all these corporations making these commitments, and Amazon video saying, oh, here's all the Black, it's all like, well, you've had this in your library forever. Why is it there now? And now it's gone, right? Now you no longer have here's all the Black stuff there. But I still believe that the moment is more promising than it has ever been. I think the fact that Biden chose Kamala Harris as his vice president shows awareness. If you read some of the articles around how he came to that decision, there was discussion, there was a sense that he was drawn to some of the white candidates. And so it shows the power of the movement of people of color, the changing conditions and political imperative. And so in that context, if you are truly committed to dealing with this legacy of anti-Black racism in this country, why can you not then support a commission which would just study what has happened, what's been the legacy, and what should be the remedies for it? And so I still think that moment is not gone, and I still think we need help to push. I think we can get to 150 plus members of Congress, and then that would put more pressure to be able to move this bill out of the Judiciary Committee and then out of the House. And then it will have more. That will be a historic step. A bill that had 2 co-sponsors in 2014 to actually pass the House will give us momentum and set things up so that hopefully come January, if there's a more receptive Congress and president, we can actually get this created and actually get this going. So that's, I think, the background to it. And again, I just want to thank you guys for your interest in the topic, as well as the lessons from having fought for redress and reparations for the Japanese American community a few decades ago. So thank you.
Thank you so much, Steve. That was so interesting. And I think when you refer to what things were like in June, you don't have to show that slide yet. But in June, I think there was a lot of emotion around the killing of George Floyd and several others in that same time period, and the videos, and also the protests. And I think because of that emotion, people were very, very interested in understanding systemic racism. But as you're saying that the emotion has come down a little bit, and it seems like we're going to have to sustain people's interest in learning more about systemic racism. And it seems like a little bit of a conundrum because in order to get a commission, people have to kind of grasp something about systemic racism. But it's like the commission that's going to really study this. So I don't know, do you have any thoughts about that? Getting over that hump? I think some of it might be community, public education and trying to build a movement. But I don't know, do you have any thoughts about, turning that emotion into like sustained interest?
Well, that's why I think that a commission is such an important, and an official commission is such an important tactical step, frankly, is that, and then frankly, that probably I was pushing in July is because there's so much attention to, rightful concern about the pandemic. I was like, well, maybe we can slide this through without it drawing too much attention and focus. But that's also, the point is that, because if you just try to bring forward the policy solutions without the whole education process, then that's even going to be more difficult. And so that, I think, is the point of why a commission is a good tactical step. And again, Democrats control the House; they can do what they want to. And so there's this nervousness about not wanting to rock the boat because everything seems to be going well, politically in terms of the polls and whatnot. Mm-hmm. But I still feel that. Particularly, I still feel in the context of the pandemic, in the context of the economic crisis, in the context of there being, suspension of the unemployment benefits and the eviction moratorium, I don't think people are going to particularly if they're getting their, unemployment insurance and getting another check from the government, they're going to be all like, well, what's this commission? I don't like you guys at all. So I still think that we have the moment to try to move it forward. Mm-hmm. And I think that's the point of the poll. If 86% of Democrats are saying they're supportive of this, it's very little political price to pay. And so I worry that the longer and longer we wait, we lose that opportunity. And so that's why I want to try to keep the pressure on these members of Congress, because there's really no justification other than political cowardice, frankly. Mm-hmm. And then the polls should really help with that you're not going to pay a political price. The conditions have changed. And so then we would at least get the call for the commission on record. Because the other thing that I don't want to depend upon this, and I think what'll help to get it, if we can get it through the House, that another option would be that, if Biden wins the White House, you could create a presidential commission to do this. But I still think having something at a very top level of government is what's going to take. But we need to push them, I feel, to seize this moment and to put some actions behind their rhetoric.
Okay. So just wanted to, for Japanese Americans who weren't around during the redress movement, I want to just give Richard a chance to say a couple words about what the CWRIC commission hearings did for Japanese Americans. Now, obviously, the World War II experience was a much smaller history than the history of African Americans in this country. But do you want to say a couple words about that, Richard?
Sure. Thanks, Susan. I think it was an opportunity for a couple of things. One, it was a real concrete opportunity for kind of internal organizing within the community as far as getting people to kind of really be willing to talk about what happened during that time period. So it really enabled groups like NCRR, NOC, and other organizations to gather people together and have conversations about, what kind of testimony should be offered. It's also an opportunity to do broad education to other people in terms of, elected officials and others. So I think it was a real organizing vehicle for us.
Yeah. Another thing that I think is interesting, and I don't know how you feel about this, Steve, but so when the proposal for the CWRIC first came out, the proposal was that there be no Japanese Americans testifying, that it be historians and legal scholars and experts and people like that. And I think that the Japanese American community felt like, people who had been in camp had never had their day in court. And that was an incredible galvanizing experience to, kind of throw off the mental and psychological oppression that people had carried with them. And so I'm just wondering what the HR40 Commission could do for grassroots African Americans. Do you think that, because when I'm thinking about African American history, there's a lot of history that scholars would have to address. But what are you're thinking about grassroots involvement?
Well, and again, it would be instructive, I think, to understand, exactly what did happen with the redress movement and that effort. I do want to look at other countries as well in terms of steps that they've actually taken. Like, I met somebody who was from Germany, and she worked at a nonprofit in this country, and she was saying that in Germany, there's this sense of national shame and guilt about the Holocaust and what was done, and a real sense of educating people and needing to, avoid repeating that mistake in history. And then she'd come to this country, and she says, there's no guilt in this country, right? And so I think there needs to be a big public education campaign that has to be led from the top levels of the government. So I can envision hearings all over the country, assuming we ever all get out of our, basements again. But you have hearings in different places, working with community organizations to bring. There really needs to be a curriculum that the country is taken through that looks at explaining what has been this history, drawing upon academics and experts and scholars, what has been the impact of it, what are the current manifestations. They have to go through all of that, and it should be community-based, working with groups, using popular culture to move the country through that process. Then we move to, okay, so if we're agreed and we understand this is what's happened, what are possible solutions? Then that leads to policy recommendations. And so that's kind of how I see the sequence of all this flowing.
Okay, that sounds good. So I'm keeping my eye on the clock, and I wanted to talk a little bit about calls to action. So Steve has talked about the call to action for putting pressure on people in Congress. And I want to, could you put up my slide just for a second? So San Jose Nikkei Resistors started doing community discussions last year. And what came out of it was a joint statement by Japanese American community organizations in the San Jose area endorsing HR40 and calling on Japanese Americans everywhere to endorse it also. And we're launching a campaign to get Japanese American community, cultural, and other organizations to endorse our statement endorsing HR40. So if people are interested in this campaign, you can contact us, sj.nikkeiresistors@gmail.com, and sign on. Okay, and now maybe we can look at some questions. Let me see.
I'm kind of typing an answer to one, so maybe I just jump in. Somebody was asking about the legal rationale for redlining. So I touched on this a little bit in my book, just looking back at it. So it had to do with what's a good loan. And so the government was justifying the loans. They were making loans to people to buy homes, but the government wanted, and then they were guaranteeing loans. They wanted to get their money back. And so the hope was that the property that was purchased would increase in value. And so they were saying they had there's an official underwriting manual from the 30s and 40s. It says the areas that are most likely to appreciate in value are the areas that have stability, social stability, and that neighborhood stability, and including racially restrictive covenants, because stability was the concept. If you bring in different races, then you have instability, and then the property values go down, and then the loans would be bad, and that's bad for the government. And so they literally drew red lines around areas that would be unstable and therefore unfavorable places to invest in terms of the government getting its money back. And so that's where redlining actually comes from, and that was the rationale at the time.
Okay. I see another question. It says, what are Japanese Americans and other Asian Americans doing to support the Black Lives Matter movement beyond HR40? I think that's for you, Richard.
Thanks a lot, Susan. So as many of you know, a number of years ago, affirmative action was struck down by Prop 209, and now we have the opportunity in November to reverse that. So Prop 16 is on the ballot for those of you who are in California. There's an active campaign, a multi-ethnic, multicultural campaign to try to get Prop 16 passed. There is opposition, and I want to just say that there is opposition within the Asian American community. So that's why I think it's so important for us to show our solidarity with Black and Latinx groups and others who are going to benefit by the passage of Prop 16. There's local committee work, and there's going to be a town hall on September the 23rd. There's opportunities to volunteer right now. If you visit the Yes on Prop 16 campaign, it's opportunity for all, Yes on Prop 16. You'll see there's a section where you can actually volunteer now. But we'd encourage people to participate in the campaign and to help get Prop 16 passed.
Great, thanks. I see a question. It says, in this context, this is from Joyce Nakamura. In this context, do you recognize the important role to play for support, to support reparations for slavery? And does that mean an important role for Japanese Americans? I'll assume that, so Steve, do you think that it's significant for Japanese Americans to support HR40?
Yeah, and maybe if I can also combine that with some of the other questions I see, Derek, hey Derek, about in terms of if someone's rep has signed on, what else can be done? I think there's a very particular moral voice that Japanese Americans have on this issue that can be significant, that differentiates. And so I think to speak from that voice of what what your community has gone through, and then to bring that to these members of Congress. So even if your geographic resident has signed on, there's still 75 other people who have not. It makes sense. We have their list. We have the names of those people. You can go to democracyincolor.com, go to up at the top of the page, Reparations Now campaign, and have those different resources in terms of getting to those people. And I think you can tweet you can call any or all of them and ask them why they're not signed on. And I think being able to accompany that question from the standpoint of a community which has been wronged and has sought redress and has been able to go through this process, I do think adds an additional level of moral authority to the call for action from the Congress members.
Thank you. There's an interesting question from Kathy Masaoka. What about support for AB 3121? Are Richard, you and Steve familiar with that? I believe that's a similar commission bill for California. Isn't that correct?
That's my understanding. And it's a good question. I don't have the actual answer to that. So my understanding is that it is a similar commission bill for California, that it has passed the Assembly, but that it's over in the Senate. And I don't know what the status of it is in the Senate. And I don't know if Gavin has spoken to whether he would sign it. And so, and you want to talk about there being no political justification for, timidity. The majority of voters in California are people of color. And so it's not like this is, Iowa or something, right? And so the political basis really should be there to be able to put, and nobody ever opposes this on the merits, but it's always, people don't want to talk about it. And the reason they don't want to talk about it is because they fear the political consequences. But on the logic and the merits and the morals of it, it's very hard to actually oppose it. But that political calculus should not factor in California. So it's a very good question. I was just looking a couple of weeks ago. I was like, what is the status of that bill in California? So what I saw there that it passed the Assembly, but it was in the Senate, and I did not see any particular plans or efforts for it to get out of the Senate. So I think that is something that we should be talking to our friends in the California State Senate about.
Yeah. Let's see. What was I had a question that I've been asked when I've discussed this with different people. And so what do you think the advantage for, like, so some people are looking at reparations for slavery as something that's very isolated, like, oh, it's just something for Black people, right? So how would you talk to people about the benefits for our entire country? Because, like, one of the things that for Japanese American redress, we felt like we were trying to put a stake in the ground for due process, regardless of race, right? And that's what a lot of the public education that we've been doing is to try to establish that as strongly as we could. And so that's to the benefit of our entire country. And so do you want to address, how do you look at reparations for slavery benefiting our entire country?
Yeah, I would say probably two things. For one is the country going to live up to its stated values? And so if we, believe that we live in a country that's founded, embraces these values of justice and equality, and yet we have profound inequality, persistent inequality, how do you reconcile those pieces? And so are we going to actually be who we say we are as a country? So that's part of it. Then there's a more tangible economic piece of the racial wealth gap. And the racial wealth gap has lots of manifestations that are harmful to the country overall, in terms of the quality of education, in terms of the availability of housing. I do think that, to the extent that you see different issues around, crime is tied to opportunity and lack of opportunity. So the quality of life of all of us would be improved if we raise the floor and address the inequality for all of us. And then I'd also feel like we started to get a little bit of in June in May and June, the period of reckoning. People are like, oh yeah, all these positions are controlled by white people. And so my flip answer, which isn't flip at all really, is that if you want better television shows, right? If you want better, popular culture and entertainment, then you need to stop the the exclusion of people of color and the elevation and preserving the whites first situations, what we have in far too many parts of our country. If we want culture and the society to reflect who is within it, then we have to break these doors down. And I feel the way to do that is to have this formal process, come to terms with the impact of it, and then make a series of significant policy changes to address it.
I also think one of the things that a lot of Asian Americans talk about is the type of racism against Asians. And I think one point that I like to make is that you can't end racism against Asians all by itself. You can't end racism against Asians if there's continuing entrenched racism against Black people and against Native Americans and against Latinos. And so I think that the thing that, for us all to realize is that this is fighting for reparations is not an act of charity. It's fully participating in improving our country and making it live up to the promise of true equality. And so I think that that's something that it's really important for people not to compartmentalize different racial groups and their situations. So
yeah, and I would just add to that, I do think that that's a risk, and the people there's an efforts to try to pit groups against one another. I mean, Trump's campaign is running these digital ads attacking in Spanish, attacking Biden for not looking more closely at a Latino potential candidate to be his vice president. Right, so they're trying to foster this interracial conflict.
Right.
But if you want to actually understand the history of this country and the contemporary reality of this country, the very first immigration law in this country said that to be a U.S. citizen, you had to be a free white person.
Right.
which the Supreme Court validated in the 1920s in the case involving a Japanese national who was found with different rights. They said, no, you can't be a citizen because you're not white. This is the United States Supreme Court saying this. And so you take that then all the way up to corporate America and Hollywood, and it's largely white men who still control everything in this country. So there's a through line here. And so it's not just a question of, oh, well, blacks are going to get something, what about my group over here? So are we going to change? Is this going to be a white country, or is this going to be a multiracial country? Mm-hmm. And that's really the fundamental issue. And then if you look at the depth and duration of the exploitation in this country, you've got to deal with African-American situation. And then that will open up it's like, I used to think it's like with Montgomery bus boycott. You know, Rosa Parks, she didn't just sit on the bus, and it wasn't just the bus boycott, just so black folks could ride the bus. It was so everybody could ride the bus. And I think it's a similar situation. If we're going to break the hold of white nationalism, open up the country to all of its non-white members, that will raise the floor for everybody.
And I see a question from Stan Shikuma. It says, how does reparations relate to the defund the police and abolition movement? Does the call for reparations resonate in the Black Lives Matter movement right now?
Yeah, I think they go together. Jessica Bird is a friend of mine. She runs the Electoral Justice Project, which is the effort within the Black Lives Matter movement to translate that energy into the electoral sphere. And so what Jessica and many of her movement allies have done is they've actually put out what's called the Breathe Act, which is a proposed 21st century Civil Rights Act that deals with a number of these components. And so defunding the police was really about rethinking public safety and refund. Like there was this article in the LA Times about the Los Angeles school district saying that, well, I can't even remember exactly what it was, but something along the lines of like, yeah, well, they'll give back the anti-missile gun. It's like something they have, like, what do you even have these things? It's like, how did you even get to the situation? So it's really rethinking the whole public safety concept. So the Breathe Act gets at the defund the police agenda, but it also calls for passing HR40. And so the analogy I used in my Nation column, we've got to deal with the police issue. If you're only looking at police and not looking at the rest of it, it's really is like focusing that there's a bank that has all this stolen money from your family, and you're only concerned about the security guard at the bank, not with the money actually in it. So it all kind of goes together. And I do believe that the leaders of the BLM movement are calling for both.
Okay. Let's see. One of the questions that I hear from Japanese Americans about reparations for slavery is people will say something like, Japanese American redress was reasonable because heirs were not included. And the implication, that's like an implied criticism of reparations for slavery because people who are alive today were not slaves, right? So what I usually tell people is that we fought to get heirs included. You know, it's actually only just to include heirs because, but we lost that. Okay, the redress bill did not include heirs. And what that meant was that if your Obasan died in camp, the US government was not held accountable for that. And if your father died the day before Reagan signed that bill, the US government is not accountable for that. So I think that's, one of the things is that the government could wait forever, but justice delayed is justice denied. So I think that's a really important thing to think about. Let's see. Okay.
Yeah. Well, and to that point, I would just say too that I think that's probably what the commission would have to study is exactly who gets it. There's different camps of opinion even within the Black community around that. But that's what's important to study the legacy and ongoing legacy. Because it's not like in 1865, after 1865, then there's no more exploitation of African Americans in this country, right? And so it's really and it's not like it doesn't exist today. right? And you even still see it in different ways that continue to manifest themselves in the perpetuation of the economic inequality in this country. So you have to look at all of it and then make some assessment around what is due to what. So it's not just a question of like, if you can directly trace your lineage to somebody who was held in slavery, then we'll give you a check for this amount of money. But it's what is happening in this country and why are Black people in the position that they are in relative to the society. How's that tied, and what responsibility does the government have, which is a lot, and then what can be done about it? So that's the ultimate question. It may tie itself into, maybe there will be some actual resources that will go directly, but fundamentally it's about redressing the situation of Black people today. And to get there, we need a commission, we need a process, and then a set of recommendations.
Okay, thank you for that. I think we're going to wrap up now because I think our panelists have to go do other things, and I think the audience has to go do other things on Saturday. But I want to thank everybody for coming. I want to especially thank our panelists. Thank you so much. You've added so much to this discussion. And I know that there's more to discuss. As I mentioned, we're just scratching the surface. But I want to encourage everybody to get on board and go look at the Democracy in Color website and sign up for the Twitter campaign. And San Jose Nikkei Resistors, we're going to be doing email campaigns as well and phone calling campaigns. So I want to thank everybody, and we'll see you again some other time. Thank you.